Now, according to the UN, there are hundreds that were killed by Israel in the West Bank, with additional fatalities resulting from settler violence. What is your interpretation to the increased aggression towards Palestinians in this region right now?
Well, in terms of the West Bank, that always is going to be the big prize for Israel. We know that arising from the Oslo agreements in 1993, 61% of the West Bank was deemed to be under full Israeli security and military control, and that is where it's placed its 500,000 settlers and its over 250 settlements in the West Bank, and is increasingly these settlements are expanding under a government, probably the most right-wing and nationalist government that Israel has known. That these settlements are expanding. There are new settlements that are being recognized, that there's more land being confiscated by the Palestinians, that the 3 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank are being herded and crowded into narrow and smaller areas of land to be able to live. So it's inevitable that the cork that Israel is trying to put on the top of the volcano is going to blow off at some time. And obviously Palestinians are rising up in the West Bank to express solidarity and support with the Palestinians in Gaza, that we've seen this unprecedented number of Palestinians killed, over 700 in the past year, because of the crackdown by the Israeli government and its very clear ambitions to want to annex all of the West Bank to Israel.
Now, given that there are no Hamas leaders and resistance groups operating in this area, in the West Bank specifically, what justification does Israel provide for its ongoing violent actions in the West Bank, with airstrikes being conducted on the West Bank for probably the first time since the Second Intifada?
Yeah, what we're seeing now is actually in filling up a enormous political vacuum, where the security forces of the Palestinian Authority are there to, in effect, protect Israeli settlers and Israeli military from attacks. But you don't see whenever Israeli forces go into Tulkarm or Nablus or Hebron, we don't see resistance coming from those security forces. You are seeing Palestinians, young Palestinians, taking, if you like, the resistance into their own hands. Weapons can be found, and they are forming armed groups. I don't know how coordinated they are. I don't know how well trained they are, but they certainly have an ambition to want to be able to resist. And they're largely outmatched by a highly trained, well-equipped, well-financed occupation army that is ensuring that there's no armed resistance to its continual march towards full annexation.
But what is the purpose of actually trying to attack refugee camps? We've seen this in Jenin, we've seen it in Tulkarm, we've seen it also in Gaza. So what do you think the purpose of it?
Well, it's in part intimidation, but it's in part in trying to ensure that you're, in the words of Israeli military and intelligence leaders, you're trying to decapitate the snake. What they're trying to argue, Israelis, is that they want calm and they want no resistance. Any resistance at all to the occupation is obviously deemed to be by an enemy entity who's practicing terrorism, and therefore must be crushed with the full force of the Israeli army. And it's not uncommon to see that most of the resistance is coming out of the refugee camps. As poor as Gaza and the West Bank are, among the poorest areas are the refugees who live in the 19 camps in the West Bank or the 8 huge camps in Gaza. That's where you see the flood of young men coming to wind up joining Palestinian armed resistance, because they're the ones who feel, if you like, the sharp edge of the Israeli occupation.
Okay, let's talk more about these settlements. Now, we've seen more settlements increasing and spreading in the last year than we've seen perhaps in the previous years, maybe the last 10 years. Now, there has been approval to the largest land seizure in the occupied West Bank in over 3 decades. Do you think Israel was seizing the opportunity that the world is focusing on Gaza, it's focusing on what's happening in Lebanon to claim more land in the West Bank?
Yes, well, as I said, the West Bank really is the major prize for Israel, not Gaza. What we're seeing is not only the expansion of existing settlements, the creation of new settlements, but if you're going to be building these new settlements or expanding the existing settlements, you need more roads to be able to connect them and to be able to have these settlers go into jobs into across the 48 borders into Israel. But you're also going to want to try to have jobs that are in those areas as well by creating industrial parks for settlers to be able to have close proximity to jobs. All of this means the confiscation, as you said, of greater and greater amounts of Palestinian land, and conversely, the herding of Palestinians into smaller and smaller parcels of land, even as that population continues to grow exponentially in the West Bank.
What is the strategy of settlements in general for the Israeli government right now? Not just in the West Bank, but also in is there a strategy in Gaza? Is there a strategy in southern Lebanon? What incentives do they actually give people to live in the settlements altogether?
Well, sure. Let's keep in mind one strategy follows another. The main strategy of the Israeli government, by having over 10% of its Israeli Jewish population in occupied territories, in the settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, is to be able to plant a flag of Israeli sovereignty that the world will have to recognize, and thereby, breach international laws against unilateral annexation by occupying powers. And the strategy for doing that is but this is the largest Israeli economic project in the history of the country. And what it's doing is giving extraordinary financial incentives for Israelis to move to the settlements by giving them much cheaper housing, cut rates with respect to mortgage, giving them all the, if you like, the military and security protection to make sure the settlements are relatively safe, make sure that the roads that the settlers drive on are going to be safe, that they are swift transport going from the settlements in the heart of the West Bank into Tel Aviv or into Jerusalem. All of this is government financed. All of this is politically backed by every single Israeli government, regardless of whether it was a Labour government or a Likud government.
Okay, we know that there are sanctions against settlements, Israeli settlements altogether in the West Bank, and we've seen that these sanctions have not been able to stop these settlements. Now, it's a violation of international law, isn't it? And how can it be stopped within the frame of international law? And how can the sanctions actually impact what's going on and stop these settlements altogether?
Sure. Let's be clear about international law. Israeli settlements have been called by the UN Security Council in December 2016 as a flagrant violation under international law, and that includes the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits occupying powers from settling its civilian population or parts of its civilian population into occupied territory. But we are also moving to a higher level with respect to this. The Rome Statute of 1998, which created the International Criminal Court, is very clear that that settlements in occupied territory are a war crime, which is among the gravest of international breaches of law that we have. And you've mentioned sanctions. We actually have hardly even touched the surface in the international community with respect to sanctions. My own country, Canada, has a free trade agreement with Israel, which allows goods and services coming from the Israeli settlements into Canada tariff-free as if they were products of Israel. I think any sanctions that are going to be meaningful with respect to cutting off the oxygen to these settlements has to be not only against the settlements themselves, but against Israel, simply because Israel and the settlements are tied by an umbilical cord. And you can sanction the settlements, that's going to mean something, but not very much. You have to sanction Israel itself for its defiance of international law.
So if we go back to the question to how to stop it in a frame of political and diplomatic efforts, is there another option? Is there a way? Is there a path?
Sure. Look, and the United Nations General Assembly and the International Court of Justice have pointed us on the path towards that. The International Court of Justice released a decision in July saying that all states have a responsibility under international law to put an end to the unlawful occupation. And that may mean stopping weapons trades, that may mean revisiting and ending free trade agreements or other forms of investment with respect to Israel. And those were endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly in its decision in its resolution in September. And the General Assembly gave Israel 12 months to end the occupation. That means the diplomatic clock has now started to tick, and the alarm bells will ring next September. I doubt if Israel will take any steps to stop this occupation. So then it's going to be in the lap of the international community to be able to decide on a much broader range of sanctions against Israel itself.